The first thing he noticed wasn't the crash, it was the silence after. The wind had died without warning, leaving the frozen plain eerily still as Noah Hayes stumbled across the fractured hull, boots crunching over ice that glittered like shattered glass, his breath fogging inside a cracked visor that barely held pressure at -40 degrees. Every inhale tasting faintly of burnt circuits and cold metal, his scavenger instincts telling him to move fast, grab anything valuable, and get out before the storm returned. But then he saw her, half buried beneath a collapsed panel, a faint blue glow pulsing beneath layers of frost like a dying ember. Well, that's new, he muttered, kneeling despite the protest in his joints, gloved hands brushing away ice to reveal smooth skin unlike anything human, luminous, almost liquid in how it caught the dim starlight, her features sharp, composed even in unconsciousness, like she belonged somewhere far above this broken world, not abandoned in it. His scanner flickered weakly as he tapped it, energy readings. Unstable, biological, alien, worth more than anything else on this rock if he dragged her back to the trade routes. Enough credits to fix his ship, enough to leave this place for good. He hesitated, just for a second, the number hanging in his mind like a lifeline. Then her chest hitched, barely, a fragile movement that shouldn't have mattered but did, and he exhaled sharply. Yeah, figures, he said under his breath, already unclipping his thermal pack, the only one he had left, pressing it against her side as the heat bled out into her frozen body, the glow beneath her skin flickering stronger in response. His suit immediately warning of dropping internal temperature, but he ignored it, focusing instead on prying the panel off her without causing more damage, metal groaning softly in the stillness. Come on, don't make this harder than it already is, he muttered, finally freeing her, her body lighter than he expected as he lifted her, careful, like she might break, her head falling against his shoulder, cool against his neck even through the suit. And for a moment everything slowed, the vast, empty horizon, the distant shadow of ruined ships, the quiet hum of failing systems. Just him and something that should have been nothing more than salvage. Except it wasn't. Not anymore. Not after he made the choice. He adjusted his grip and started walking, each step heavy against the frozen ground, knowing the storm would return, knowing his odds were getting worse by the minute, knowing he could have walked away, should have walked away, but he didn't. And somewhere between one breath and the next, the alien in his arms stirred, a faint sound slipping past her lips, soft but clear enough for his translator to catch. Primitive, she whispered, and despite everything, Noah let out a quiet, tired laugh. Yeah, he said, voice rough, steadying her as he kept moving into the endless cold. Still carrying you, though. The storm came back faster than expected, a low howl at first, then a rising wall of ice-filled wind that scraped across Noah's suit like sandpaper as he pushed forward, boots sinking half an inch into frozen dust with every step, his visor flickering warnings in dull red text, internal temperature dropping, power reserves unstable, and still he kept moving, shifting the alien girl higher in his arms as her faint glow pulsed unevenly against his chest, the only source of warmth he had left. You picked a bad day to crash, he muttered, more to himself than her, though part of him wondered if she could hear it, if somewhere beneath that calm, distant face she understood any of this, the cold, the silence, the stubborn human refusing to leave her behind. His shelter came into view through the storm, a half-buried cargo container wedged between jagged rocks, barely more than a metal box, but enough to block the wind. Home sweet home, he breathed, forcing the hatch open with a grunt, as frozen hinges protested, then stepping inside and sealing it behind him. The sudden quiet almost disorienting after the storm's roar. He laid her down carefully on a worn thermal blanket, his hands slower now, fingers stiff from cold, his suit releasing a final warning chime before dimming to conserve power. He ignored it, focusing instead on her, brushing frost from her skin, watching the faint blue light beneath it flicker like a failing signal. Do not die on me now, he said under his breath, reaching for a portable heater and slamming it onto the metal floor. It sputtered once, twice, then hummed weakly to life, barely enough to warm the space, but enough to keep the temperature from dropping further. He sat back against the wall, pulling off his cracked helmet, cold air biting immediately at his face as he exhaled slowly. The room filled with the faint smell of heated metal and something unfamiliar, something almost sweet coming from her. Hours seemed to pass in silence, broken only by the soft hum of the heater and the distant howl of the storm outside, until finally she moved. A subtle shift, her fingers twitching against the blanket. Noah straightened instantly, every muscle tightening as her eyes opened. Not human eyes, brighter, sharper, catching the dim light with an almost reflective glow. They locked onto him immediately, focused despite everything. Calculating. "You brought me here," she said, her voice steady but faint. The translator in his suit struggling for a second before smoothing out her words. Noah let out a quiet breath, half relief, half disbelief. "Yeah," he answered, running a hand through his hair. Did not have a better plan. Her gaze flickered across the small shelter, taking in every detail in seconds. The worn tools, the patched walls, the single failing heater, then back to him, and for a moment something unreadable passed through her expression. "This structure is inefficient," she said, and despite himself, Noah laughed softly, shaking his head. "You are welcome," he replied, leaning back against the cold metal, watching her closely as she tried to sit up and failed, her body not responding the way it should, a faint tension crossing her features. "Do not," he said, more gently this time. "You are still recovering," she stilled, eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him again, longer now, more carefully, as if reassessing something she thought she already understood. "Why?" she asked after a moment. The word simple, but carrying more weight than anything else she had said. Noah frowned slightly, caught off guard. "Why what?" he asked, and she held his gaze without blinking, her voice quieter this time, almost uncertain. "Why would a primitive choose to save me?" Noah did not answer right away, not because he did not understand the question, but because he did, and there was no clean way to explain something that had never needed explaining before. He shifted slightly against the cold metal wall, watching her as the faint blue glow beneath her skin steadied just a little, the heater humming weakly between them like it was trying to keep up with something far bigger than a small shelter on a frozen rock. "I do not know," he said finally, voice quiet, honest in a way that surprised even him. "You were there, and you needed help." Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying him with that same precise, almost surgical focus, as if searching for a hidden layer beneath his words. "That is not a logical justification," she replied, her tone regaining a hint of the sharp certainty from before, but it was thinner now, less solid. Noah let out a small breath that might have been a laugh, rubbing his hands together to bring back some warmth. "Yeah, I get that a lot," he said, glancing at her. "Does not have to be logical." She was silent for a moment, and in that silence something shifted again, subtle but real, her gaze drifting briefly to the thermal pack still resting against her side, then to his suit where the missing heat source had left frost creeping along the seams. Her eyes lingered there longer than before. "You are degrading your own survival probability," she said, slower now, as if testing each word. Noah shrugged lightly, though. The movement cost him more than he let on. "Probably," he admitted. "Would not be the first time." She looked back at him sharply at that, something like confusion flickering beneath the surface, not the dismissive kind she carried before, but something closer to curiosity, unrefined, unfamiliar. "Your species is inefficient," she said, but there was no edge to it now, only observation. Noah smiled faintly, leaning his head back against the wall, eyes closing for a second as fatigue pressed in. "We are still here," he replied, and that seemed to stop her, truly stop her, her expression going still as if the statement had landed somewhere deeper than expected. Outside the shelter the storm howled louder, rattling the metal walls, but inside the space felt smaller, quieter, focused entirely on the space between them. She shifted again, slower this time, forcing her body to respond, her fingers curling slightly against the blanket, her systems trying to recalibrate. "Your name," she said after a moment, the words softer now, less like a command and more like a request. Noah opened his eyes again, meeting her gaze. "Noah," he answered, then tilted his head slightly. "You." There was a pause, brief but noticeable, as if the answer required more than simple recall. "Aris," she said, And the way she said it felt different. Not a title, not a designation, but something closer to identity. He nodded once, like that was enough, because for him it was, well, Aris, he said quietly, glancing toward the flickering heater and then back at her. You are going to be fine. She watched him for a long moment after that, longer than necessary. Her expression unreadable, but no longer distant. Something was changing, not just in how she saw him, but in how she processed everything around her. And somewhere beneath the steady pulse of her bioluminescent skin, a new rhythm began to form, subtle, unmeasured, and completely outside the system she had been designed to trust. She did not understand it. Not yet, but for the first time. Since waking, she did not dismiss it either. The heater sputtered again, its low hum stuttering like it might give up at any second, and Noah leaned forward instinctively, tapping the side of it with a gloved hand, as if that alone could convince it to keep going. Do not die on me too, he muttered, the words half a joke, half a quiet plea. Behind him, Aris watched the movement closely, her eyes tracking every small adjustment he made, every inefficient, imprecise action that somehow still worked. The glow beneath her skin had stabilized, no longer flickering erratically but pulsing in a slow, steady rhythm. And yet something else had changed, something she could not quantify. She shifted slightly, testing her strength again, this time managing to push herself up just enough to sit against the container wall, her breathing controlled but not entirely steady. Noah noticed immediately, his attention snapping back to her. Easy, he said, pushing himself up despite the stiffness in his limbs, crossing the small space between them in 2 steps. You are not ready for that yet, she paused, looking up at him as he adjusted the blanket around her shoulders without hesitation, his hands careful, unassuming, like this was something he had done 1,000 times before. You assume much, she said, but the edge was softer now, almost absent. Noah shrugged lightly, though his movements were slower now, more deliberate. I assume you just woke up from a crash in subzero weather and almost froze solid, he replied, meeting her gaze briefly before stepping back, giving her space again. That is usually a good time to take it easy. She studied him again, longer this time, her expression no longer dismissive but searching, analyzing something beyond his words, beyond his actions, something she did not yet have a framework for. Your behavior is inconsistent with self-preservation protocols, she said quietly, and Noah let out a faint breath, glancing toward the sealed hatch as the storm rattled against it. Yeah, he said, we are not big on protocols where I come from. That earned a brief pause from her, the kind that suggested she was not dismissing the statement outright, but actually considering it. Outside, the wind howled louder, a long, drawn-out sound that vibrated through the metal walls, and for a moment the entire structure seemed to shift under the pressure. Noah's eyes flicked toward the ceiling, calculating automatically, then back to her. Storm is not letting up anytime soon, he said, more to himself than her. We are going to be stuck here for a while. Aris followed his gaze, then looked back at him. Your vessel, she said. It is nearby? Noah shook his head once. Couple miles out, he answered. Too far in this weather. She absorbed that information quickly, her mind already running through variables, probabilities, outcomes. But then her attention shifted again, back to him, to the frost creeping along the edges of his suit, to the subtle tremor in his hands he was trying to hide. You are experiencing thermal loss, she said, and this time there was no judgment in her tone, only observation. Noah huffed a quiet laugh, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, that tends to happen when you give away your only heat source, he said, and for a second neither of them spoke, the words settling into the space between them, heavier than expected. Aris looked down at the thermal pack still resting against her side, then back at him, her expression shifting in a way that was small but undeniable. This was yours, she said, slower now. Noah nodded once. He corrected lightly. Seems like you needed it more. She held his gaze again, longer than before, something unfamiliar moving beneath the surface, not confusion this time, not exactly, but something closer to recognition, incomplete, unprocessed, and yet impossible to ignore. That is not efficient, she said quietly, and Noah smiled faintly, the kind of tired, almost amused expression that did not need explaining. No, he agreed, settling back against the wall again, pulling his arms closer to conserve what little warmth he had left. It is not. The heater hummed weakly between them. The storm pressed harder against the outside world. And in the small space between two completely different beings, something intangible shifted again, not spoken, not defined, but growing all the same. The silence stretched longer this time, not empty, but full of small, unspoken things, the kind that settled into the air and refused to leave. Noah could feel the cold pushing in again, slow and patient, creeping through the seams of his suit and into his bones, his breath coming out in faint, uneven clouds as he rubbed his hands together, trying to bring back warmth that was not there anymore. Across from him, Aris watched everything, not just his movements but the pauses between them, the slight delay in his reactions, the way his shoulders tensed and relaxed like he was constantly calculating how much energy he had left. "Your condition is deteriorating," she said. Quietly, no accusation, no edge, just a statement. Noah glanced at her and gave a small shrug. "Yeah," he admitted, "working on it." He reached for a small metal case near the wall, flipping it open to reveal a handful of tools and a compact power cell. He connected it to the heater with practiced motions, the device sputtering before stabilizing into a slightly stronger hum, the temperature rising just enough to make a difference. "There," he said under his breath, leaning back again. "That buys us some time." Aris followed every movement closely, her eyes narrowing slightly as she processed the sequence. "Your technology is inefficient," she said. But there was hesitation now, as if the word no longer carried the certainty it once did. Noah smiled faintly, eyes half closed as he rested his head against the wall. "It works," he replied simply, and that seemed to stay with her, longer than expected. She looked down at her own hands, flexing her fingers slowly, feeling the response. Return, the glow beneath her skin steady, controlled, her system stabilizing. And yet there was something else layered beneath that stability, something her internal diagnostics did not recognize. Her gaze lifted back to him, lingering on the frost along his collar, the faint tremor he could no longer fully hide. "You are sacrificing functional efficiency for my survival," she said, slower now, as if the concept itself required careful handling. Noah let out a quiet breath, eyes still closed. "I guess you could say that," he answered. "We usually just call it helping." The word hung in the air between them, simple, almost insignificant, and yet it did not align with anything in her understanding. "Helping," she repeated softly, testing the sound. The meaning, her species did not operate on such undefined principles. Actions were calculated, outcomes optimized, variables controlled. But this was none of those things, and still, it had worked. She was alive because of it. Her gaze shifted again, this time not just observing but lingering, searching his face for something she had not noticed before, the lines of fatigue, the quiet stubbornness, the absence of expectation. He had not asked for anything, not compensation, not recognition, not even acknowledgement. He had simply acted, and that unsettled her more than anything else. "Noah," she said, his name coming more naturally now, less like a designation and more like a connection. He opened one eye slightly, glancing at her. "Yeah," he replied, and she paused, just for a second, as if choosing her words required more effort than it should. "If the variables were reversed," she said slowly, "my kind would not have made the same choice." Noah studied her for a moment, then gave a small, almost amused nod. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I figured that." There was no judgment in his tone, no bitterness, just a simple acknowledgement, and somehow that made it heavier. Outside the storm roared on, relentless, but inside the small shelter the air felt different now, warmer than it should have been, not because of the heater, but because something invisible had shifted, something neither of them fully understood yet. Aris looked at him again, longer this time, and for the first time since she had woken, she did not see him as primitive, not as something lesser, but as something undefined, something her world had never accounted for. And that realization did not come with clarity. It came with a quiet, unsettling pull she could not ignore. The heater's hum settled into a fragile rhythm, steady but thin, like it could vanish if either of them stopped paying attention, and Noah found himself watching it more than anything else, not because it was interesting, but because it was the only thing in the room he could still control, His fingers moved slowly over the side panel, adjusting a loose connection with careful precision, each movement deliberate. Conserving energy he did not have, across from him Aris observed in silence, her posture more stable now, her breathing even, her systems no longer struggling to maintain basic function. Yet her focus was not on herself. It stayed on him, on the small inefficiencies in his actions that somehow produced results, on the way he adapted instead of optimizing, reacting instead of calculating. Your methods rely on approximation, she said quietly, her voice no longer sharp, but thoughtful. Noah did not look up, a faint smile touching his lips as he tightened the final contact. That is one way to put it, he replied, tapping the heater once more before leaning back again, exhaling slowly. We call it figuring things out. Aris considered that, the phrase looping through her mind, not as data, but as something more fluid, less defined. Figuring things out implies uncertainty, she said. Uncertainty reduces efficiency. Noah tilted his head slightly, eyes half open as he glanced at her. Yeah, he said. But it also means you are still trying. That answer did not resolve anything in her logic systems. But it did not get rejected either. It lingered, suspended somewhere between incorrect and incomplete. She shifted her gaze again, drawn once more to the subtle signs of his condition, the faint delay in his responses, the shallow way his chest rose and fell, his body compensating without conscious thought. You are continuing to degrade, she said, softer now, almost as if the words themselves required caution. Noah let out a quiet breath, the corner of his mouth lifting just slightly. You keep pointing that out like I can do something about it, he replied, his tone light, but his eyes tired. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked down at the thermal pack still pressed against her side, the steady warmth radiating through her system, then back at him, something shifting again beneath the surface. Something she was not designed to interpret. There is a corrective action, she said after a moment, her voice slower, more deliberate than before. Noah raised an eyebrow slightly, curiosity cutting through the fatigue. Yeah, he asked, and she reached for the edge of the blanket, her movements controlled but purposeful. Thermal redistribution, she said, as if stating a technical procedure, but there was a subtle pause beneath it, something that did not belong in a purely logical framework. Noah watched her for a second, understanding dawning before he shook his head lightly. No, he said, simple, immediate. Aris stilled, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in irritation, but in confusion. Refusal is inefficient, she stated, and Noah gave a faint, tired laugh, leaning his head back against the wall again. You are going to have to get used to that, he replied, closing his eyes briefly. I am not taking it back. The words were not defensive, not stubborn in the way she expected. They were quiet, final, and that made them harder to process. She studied him again, longer this time, searching for the underlying variable, the hidden calculation that would make the decision make sense. But there was none, not in the way she understood, and that absence did something unexpected. It unsettled her, not because it was wrong, but because it suggested something beyond her current framework. Outside, the storm began to shift, the howl softening just slightly, the first sign of change in hours, but neither of them noticed immediately, because inside the small shelter, something else had already begun to change, something quieter, more profound. Aris leaned back slowly against the wall, her gaze still fixed on him, and for the first time since her awakening, her analysis did not conclude. It did not resolve into a clear outcome. Instead, it remained open, unfinished, and somewhere in that unfinished space, a new question formed, one she had never needed to ask before, not about survival, not about efficiency, but about him, and why his presence altered variables that should have remained constant. The storm did not stop all at once. It faded slowly, like the world outside was remembering how to breathe again, the howling wind thinning into long, distant whispers that barely rattled the metal walls, and Noah noticed it before he realized he had been listening for it the entire time, his eyes opening slightly as the silence crept back in, different from before, softer, less threatening. That is new, he murmured, his voice rough from cold and disuse. Aris followed his gaze toward the sealed hatch, her senses sharper now, recalibrated, detecting the subtle drop in atmospheric pressure shifts, the absence of constant impact against the structure. The storm is weakening, she confirmed, her tone steady but quieter than before, as if the moment required it. Noah nodded once, pushing himself up with a small effort that showed more than he intended, his hand pressing briefly against the wall for support before he steadied. Good, he said, exhaling slowly. Means we might actually get out of here. He took a step toward the hatch, then paused, the movement costing him more than expected, a flicker of dizziness passing through him before he forced it down. Aris saw it. Not just the hesitation, but the fraction of a second where his balance shifted, where his body failed to respond instantly. And something in her expression tightened, not in confusion this time, but in recognition. Your condition is approaching critical thresholds, she said, and there was no distance left in her voice now. Only direct concern, though she did not yet understand that was what it was. Noah let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh, one hand resting against the cold metal beside the hatch. Yeah, he admitted quietly. I was hoping not to hear that out loud. He reached for the manual latch, fingers slower now, less precise, and twisted it open with a low metallic click, the door shifting just enough to let a thin line of pale light cut into the dim shelter, cold air slipping through immediately, sharp but no longer biting. He stepped back slightly, letting the opening widen, the outside world revealed in fragments, endless white stretching across the horizon, broken only by distant shapes of wreckage and rock. The sky above clearer now, faint streaks of light cutting through the thinning clouds. Aris watched him instead of the horizon, her attention fixed entirely on him as he stood there, framed by the open hatch, the light catching the frost along his suit, outlining the small, persistent tremor in his hands. We should move, she said, her voice steady but faster now, more urgent. Your survival window is narrowing. Noah glanced back at her, one eyebrow lifting slightly despite everything. You are getting better at this, he said, and there was a hint of something softer in his tone, something almost approving. Aris did not respond to that, her focus unbroken. Your vessel is 2 miles from this location, she continued, her voice precise. Again, but no longer cold. Under current conditions, you will not reach it alone. Noah leaned lightly against the edge of the hatch, looking out at the frozen landscape, then back at her. Good thing I am not alone then, he said, and for a moment neither of them moved, the words settling between them with a weight neither had expected. Aris held his gaze, something shifting again beneath the surface, not confusion, not curiosity, but something closer to decision, something forming without calculation, without protocol. Correct, she said finally, the word quieter than it should have been, and yet more certain than anything she had said before. She pushed herself up fully this time, slower but controlled, her body responding as it should, the glow beneath her skin steady and bright. And when she stepped forward, it was not just movement, it was intention. She reached his side and paused, close enough now to feel the difference in temperature, to sense the strain his body was under. And for a brief moment, she hesitated, not because she did not know what to do, but because she did not know why she was choosing to do it. Then she extended her hand, not as a command, not as a calculation, but as something else entirely, something unmeasured. Then we proceed together, she said, and Noah looked at her hand, then at her, a faint smile forming despite the cold, despite the exhaustion. Yeah, he said quietly, reaching out to take it. Together sounds good. The cold hit differently outside, no longer a violent force but a steady, relentless presence that pressed in from all sides as Noah stepped out of the shelter, boots sinking into the frozen surface with a dull crunch, the air thin and sharp in his lungs as he exhaled slowly, his grip tightening instinctively around Aris's hand for balance, her skin warmer now, not just from the thermal pack, but from something internal, something steady, controlled. She adjusted her stance immediately, compensating for his uneven weight distribution without being told, her movements precise, efficient, but there was something new beneath that precision, something that was not part of her original design. 2 miles, she said, her gaze scanning the horizon, mapping the terrain with quiet focus. Bearing 087 degrees. Noah followed her line of sight, squinting slightly against the pale light reflecting off the endless white. I will take your word for it, he said, his voice low but steady. They began moving together, their steps uneven at first, his slower, hers measured to match, the rhythm forming gradually, not perfect, but functional. The kind of coordination that came not from calculation, but from adaptation. The wind brushed past them in long, quiet currents, carrying fine particles of ice that shimmered briefly in the light before settling again. Noah's breathing grew heavier with each step, the cold seeping deeper now, his body struggling to maintain heat. But he did not stop. Not yet. Beside him, Aris tracked every change, every fluctuation in his movement, his pace, his breathing, her internal systems registering the decline with increasing clarity. "You are exceeding sustainable limits," she said, her tone calm but firm. Noah let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh. "Yeah," he replied. "That tends to happen when you walk through a frozen wasteland with no backup plan." She did not respond to the humor this time, her focus narrowing, recalculating, adjusting variables that no longer followed predictable patterns. "Reduce speed," she said. "Conserve energy." Noah shook his head slightly. "The motion small but definitive. If we slow down, we freeze," he answered, his voice quieter now, more strained. "We keep moving." Aris absorbed that, not as a command, but as a decision, one that conflicted with optimal survival strategies and yet held its own logic, a different kind, one she was still learning to interpret. They moved in silence for a while after that, the distance stretching out ahead of them, indistinct but present, time losing its clear structure as each step blended into the next, until Noah's footing faltered, just slightly, his knee dipping lower than intended before he caught himself, his grip tightening unconsciously around her hand. Aris stopped immediately, turning toward him, her eyes scanning his condition with rapid precision. "Stabilize," she said, stepping closer, her free hand moving to support his arm without hesitation. Noah let out a slow breath, nodding once. "I am good," he said. Though the words carried less certainty than before, she did not release him, her hold steady, calculated, but the reason behind it no longer purely functional. They stood there for a brief moment, the world around them quiet, vast, and different. And in that stillness, something shifted again, subtle but undeniable. Aris adjusted her position slightly, redistributing his weight more effectively, her movements instinctive now, no longer requiring conscious calculation. "We proceed," she said, and this time the words did not sound like a directive. They sounded like a promise. Noah glanced at her, a faint, tired smile crossing his face despite everything. "Yeah," he said softly. "We do." And together they moved forward again. Not because it was the most efficient path, not because it guaranteed success, but because stopping was no longer an option, not for either of them. The horizon did not change much at first, just endless white stretching in every direction. But no one noticed it anyway. The faint dark shape breaking the line where sky met ground, small, distant, but real. "There," he said under his breath, his voice thinner now, carried away almost immediately by the wind. Aris followed his gaze, her vision sharpening the outline, confirming the structure, metal, angular, partially buried but intact. His vessel, 2 miles, had turned into something closer, something reachable, distance reduced to approximately 1 mile, she said, her tone steady but faster than before, and that shift mattered. Noah let out a slow breath, something like relief flickering across his face before he forced his focus forward again. "Good," he said quietly, but his steps did not quicken. They slowed, just slightly, the weight of the journey finally catching up, his boots dragging a fraction longer with each step, the rhythm they had built beginning to fracture at the edges. Aris adjusted immediately, tightening her hold on his arm, compensating for the imbalance. But this time it was not enough to fully stabilize him. His breathing grew heavier, uneven, the cold pressing deeper, taking more than it gave back. "You must stop," she said, the words sharper now, cutting through the quiet. Noah shook his head once, the motion small but absolute. "If I stop, I am not starting again," he replied, and there was no argument in his voice, only fact. She processed that, not as resistance, but as data, final, unchangeable. And for a moment she hesitated, something within her systems attempting to reconcile the conflict. Preserve the human, preserve the mission, But the variables no longer aligned cleanly. They never had, and yet she had followed them anyway. "Then you do not stop," she said finally, her voice lower, more certain, stepping closer as she shifted his weight more directly onto her, no longer just assisting, but carrying part of the load. Noah glanced at her, surprise flickering briefly before it softened into something else. Something quieter. "You are learning," he said, the words almost lost in the wind. Aris did not respond. Her focus locked forward, but something in her expression shifted, not outwardly, but internally, a recalibration not of systems, but of purpose. They moved again, slower now, but steadier, her support compensating for what he was losing, the distance closing in small increments that felt larger than they should, until Noah's foot caught on uneven ice, his balance breaking completely this time as his knee dropped hard into the frozen surface, his hand tightening around hers reflexively. Aris stopped instantly, lowering with him, her other hand bracing his shoulder, her movements precise but faster than before, driven by something that was no longer purely calculated. "Noah," she said, his name sharper now, not as a label, but as something closer to urgency. He exhaled slowly, his breath uneven, his head lowering for a second before he forced it back up. "I am still here," he said, though the effort behind the words was clear. She scanned him again, her internal systems flagging critical thresholds, energy depletion, thermal failure, but the numbers did not matter in the same way anymore. They did not dictate the outcome. "Not here, not now, you will not reach the vessel at current output," she said. And this time there was no distance, no neutrality, only the truth as she understood it. Noah gave a faint, tired smile, shaking his head slightly. "Then I guess it is a good thing I am not doing this alone," he replied. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow, the wind fading into the background, the distance ahead becoming secondary. Aris held his gaze, something in her shifting again, deeper this time, not just recognition, not just curiosity, but decision, complete and irreversible. She adjusted her stance, anchoring herself against the cold ground, and then, without hesitation, she pulled him up, not forcing, not commanding, but supporting fully, her strength compensating for his loss. "Correct," she said quietly, and there was no trace of doubt left in her voice. "You are not alone." And with that, they moved forward again, not as separate variables, not as calculated outcomes, but as something shared, something chosen. And ahead of them, the dark shape of the vessel grew clearer against the white. The ship looked closer than it felt, its dark hull rising out of the frozen landscape like something half-forgotten, edges buried under layers of ice and time. And Noah focused on it the way people focused on a finish line, not because it guaranteed anything, but because it gave direction, his steps slower now, each one deliberate, measured against what little energy he had left. Aris stayed beside him, her support constant, adjusting with every shift in his balance, no longer reacting, but anticipating. 50 yards, she said, her voice steady, though something beneath it carried weight now, something that did not belong to pure calculation. Noah nodded faintly, his breath coming out in uneven clouds, his vision narrowing slightly at the edges. But he kept moving, because stopping was still not an option. Not yet. The hatch came into view, partially sealed with frost, the control panel dark, inactive. He reached it with a final step that felt heavier than all the others combined. His hand lifting slowly toward the interface, fingers brushing against the frozen surface. "Come on," he murmured, his voice low. Almost lost to the air, he pressed the manual override. Nothing happened. The panel remained dark, unresponsive. He exhaled slowly, his head lowering for a second. "That is not ideal," he said quietly. Aris stepped forward immediately, her hand moving to the panel, her touch more precise, more controlled, her systems interfacing with the dormant circuitry, a faint pulse of light flickering beneath her fingers. "Power grid is offline," she said, her focus narrowing. "External systems. Non-functional." Noah let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh, though it carried no humor now. "Of course it is," he replied, leaning slightly against the hull, the metal cold even through his suit, his strength slipping further with each second. Aris did not look at him this time. Her attention locked on the panel, her internal systems recalculating, searching for a solution that did not rely on optimal conditions, something closer to what he had shown her, adaptation instead of perfection. There is an alternative, she said after a moment, her voice lower, more focused. Noah glanced at her, his eyes tired but attentive. I am listening, he said, and she paused, just briefly, as if the next step required more than simple execution. I can reroute internal energy reserves, she explained, sufficient to initiate emergency access protocols. Noah frowned slightly, the idea forming quickly in his mind despite the fog creeping in. And what does that cost you? He asked, his voice quieter now. Aris did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting to him for the first time since they reached the ship. And in that look, there was something different, something he had not seen before, not calculation, not observation, but choice. Efficiency, she said finally. But the word felt incomplete, insufficient. Noah held her gaze for a moment, understanding settling in despite the cold, despite the exhaustion. You do not have to do that, he said, the words soft but certain. Aris studied him, her expression steady, but something beneath it had already resolved. You made a choice, she said quietly. Now I do the same. There was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty left. She turned back to the panel, her hand pressing firmly against the interface as her internal systems shifted, energy redirecting, the faint glow beneath her skin intensifying, brighter than before, the panel flickering in response. Weak at first, then stronger, systems waking one by one, the hatch releasing with a low mechanical sound, frost cracking along its edges as it began to open. Noah watched her, the movement, the light, the quiet determination behind it. And for a moment, the cold, the distance, the struggle, all of it faded into something simpler, something clearer. Aris, he said softly, and she did not look at him this time. But she heard it, the way he said her name, not as a label, not as a designation, but as something else entirely, something human. And when the hatch finally opened, revealing the dark interior of the ship, she stepped back just enough for him to enter first, her movement steady, her choice already made. Proceed, she said, and for the first time, the word did not sound like a command, it sounded like trust. The air inside the ship felt different, still cold but no longer biting, contained instead of endless. And Noah crossed the threshold slowly, one hand bracing against the inner wall as his boots met the metal floor with a dull echo, the sound grounding in a way the open wasteland never could. The interior lights flickered weakly overhead, casting long shadows across narrow corridors lined with worn panels and exposed wiring. Home, he murmured under his breath, though it sounded more like a memory than a statement. Aris stepped in behind him, the hatch sealing with a low hiss that cut off the outside world completely. And for the first time since the crash, there was no wind, no endless horizon, just a confined space that held its own quiet. She paused for a fraction of a second, her gaze sweeping across the interior, mapping it instantly, the structure, the layout, the faint energy signatures buried beneath inactive systems. But her attention shifted quickly, back to him. Noah had only taken a few steps before his balance gave out again, his shoulder hitting the wall harder than he intended as he tried to stay upright, his breath uneven now, shallow, his body finally reaching the limit it had been pushing against for too long. Aris moved without hesitation, closing the distance in a single step, her hand steadying him before he could fall further. Stabilize, she said. But the word lacked its previous detachment. It carried urgency now. Something immediate, something personal. Noah let out a slow breath, his head lowering slightly as he leaned into the support. Yeah, he replied quietly, working on that. But the effort behind the words was clear. His strength was fading fast. Aris adjusted her grip, guiding him toward a nearby seat, her movements precise but faster than before, driven by something beyond efficiency. She lowered him carefully, ensuring his weight was supported before stepping back just enough to assess, her internal systems scanning, calculating, but the numbers no longer dictated her actions the way they once did. Internal temperature critically low, she said, her voice steady, but softer now. You require immediate stabilization. Noah gave a faint, tired smile, his eyes half closed as he leaned back against the seat. You keep saying that, he murmured, starting to think it is serious. Aris did not respond to the attempt at humor, her focus narrowing as she moved through the ship with controlled urgency, her hand brushing against panels, reactivating subsystems one by one. Faint lights coming to life in response, the ship responding slowly but steadily, like something waking from a long sleep. She returned moments later with a thermal unit, activating it beside him, the device emitting a low, steady heat that began to push back against the cold. Noah exhaled slowly as the warmth reached him, his shoulders easing just slightly. But it was not enough. Not yet. Aris watched him closely, her gaze fixed, tracking every subtle change, every small improvement, every lingering weakness. And beneath that observation, something else continued to grow. Something she could no longer classify as simple analysis. "You expended all available resources," she said quietly, her voice lower now, almost reflective. Noah opened his eyes slightly, looking at her with a faint, tired clarity. "Yeah," he admitted, "that happens sometimes." She held his gaze, the silence stretching between them, not empty, but full. And for the first time, she did not attempt to fill it with data, with logic, with explanation. Instead, she stayed there, present, something unfamiliar settling into place. "It was not efficient," she said after a moment, but the words no longer carried judgment. Noah let out a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "No," he agreed, "but it worked." And that was it. No further explanation, no justification, just a simple truth. Aris absorbed that, not as information, but as something else, something that did not resolve, did not conclude, but remained. And in that moment, as the ship slowly came back to life around them, she understood something she had not been designed to understand, not fully, not completely, but enough to change the way she saw him, the way she saw the choices he made, and the way those choices reshaped everything around them. The warmth inside the ship grew slowly, not enough to erase the cold entirely, but enough to push it back inch by inch, and Noah could feel it returning to his hands first, a faint tingling that burned more than it soothed. His breathing still uneven but steadier now, each inhale less shallow than the last. He sat there in silence, eyes half closed, listening to the quiet hum of systems coming back online, a sound that felt almost distant, like it belonged to another moment, another version of him that had not nearly frozen 2 miles out in the open. Across from him, Aris remained still, her posture upright but no longer rigid, her gaze fixed on him with a focus that had changed, no longer scanning for faults or variables, but watching, observing in a way that did not reduce him to data. The faint glow beneath her skin had dimmed back to a steady, controlled pulse, her systems stabilized, efficient, precise, exactly as they were designed to be, and yet something within her did not feel as contained as before. Something remained unsettled, incomplete. She took a slow step closer, the sound of her movement soft against the metal floor. Noah's eyes opened slightly at the shift, his attention returning to her. "You look like you are about to say something important," he said quietly, his voice still rough but carrying a trace of that familiar tone, the one that did not take anything too seriously. Even now, Aris paused for a fraction of a second, the words forming but not aligning the way they should, not fitting into the structured clarity she was accustomed to. "Your actions," she began, her voice steady but slower than before, "they do not conform to expected behavioral models." Noah let out a faint breath that might have been a laugh. "Yeah," he said softly. "I have been told that." But she did not stop this time. She did not dismiss the thought or reduce it to a simple observation. Instead, she continued, "You accepted reduced survival probability to ensure mine," she said, her eyes holding his, not analyzing now, but searching. "And you did so without expectation of return." Noah shifted slightly in his seat, the warmth beginning to reach deeper now, easing some of the tension in his muscles. "That is usually how it works," he replied, his tone quiet, almost matter-of-fact. Aris studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching between them again. But this time it felt different, not uncertain, not incomplete, but building towards something. "My species does not operate this way," she said finally, and there was something in her voice now, something that did not belong to logic alone. "We optimize, we calculate, we eliminate unnecessary variables." Noah nodded slightly, listening, his expression calm. Yeah, he said. I figured that too. Aris took another step closer, stopping just within reach, her gaze steady, unwavering. Then explain this, she said. And the words were not a demand, not a command, but something else entirely, something closer to a request, something she had not been designed to make. Noah met her gaze. And for a moment he did not answer, not because he could not, but because the answer was not something that fit neatly into words, not something that could be measured or defined. He exhaled slowly, a small, tired smile forming at the edge of his lips. It is simple, he said quietly. You needed help. Aris did not look away, did not interrupt, her expression still, absorbing every part of that answer. And that is sufficient, she asked, her voice softer now, almost uncertain. Noah nodded once, the motion small but certain. Yeah, he said. It is. The simplicity of it did not resolve her internal conflict. It did not align with her systems or her understanding, but it did something else, something deeper. It stayed. It remained. And for the first time, she did not try to correct it, did not try to redefine it. Instead, she accepted it, not as logic, but as truth, incomplete, unstructured, but real. And in that moment, something within her shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally, a change not in her systems, but in how she chose to use them, how she chose to see the world, and the humans sitting in front of her, no longer as an anomaly to be explained, but as something far more significant, something that had altered the way she understood everything that came after. The ship settled into a quiet that felt almost alive, systems humming in low, steady tones as heat slowly filled the space, pushing the cold further into memory. Noah leaned back in his seat, his breathing finally even, not strong yet, but stable, his eyes half open as he watched the faint lights flicker across the control panel, familiar patterns returning one by one, like pieces of a life he had almost lost outside. Aris stood a few feet away, still, composed, but not distant, her gaze resting on him without calculation, without the constant need to define or categorize. The silence between them no longer uncertain, no longer searching, but understood in a way that did not need words. Outside the small viewport, the frozen world stretched endlessly, pale and quiet, untouched by what had just happened within its reach. And for a moment, neither of them moved, as if the stillness itself held something important, something worth preserving. Your systems are stabilizing, Aris said quietly, her voice softer now, carrying none of the rigid precision it once had. Noah let out a slow breath, a faint smile forming as he turned his head slightly toward her. Told you I would be fine, he replied, and this time the humor was easier, lighter, like it belonged again. Aris did not correct him, did not point out the margin by which that statement had almost been false. Instead, she stepped closer, stopping beside him, her presence calm, steady, chosen, not required. You made a choice without certainty, she said after a moment, her eyes meeting his, and it altered the outcome. Noah considered that. The words simple but carrying weight. Yeah, he said quietly. That tends to happen. She studied him for a second longer, then shifted her gaze toward the viewport, the frozen landscape reflecting faintly in her eyes. My kind would have calculated the risk, she said, her voice thoughtful now, not distant, and chosen differently. Noah followed her gaze, the white expanse stretching far beyond what either of them could see. Probably, he agreed. Aris turned back to him then, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before, not confusion, not curiosity, but clarity, formed not from data, but from experience. Then they would have been wrong, she said, and the words did not sound like a conclusion. They sounded like a realization, quiet but absolute. Noah looked at her, really looked this time, not at the glow beneath her skin or the precision in her movements, but at the shift in how she carried herself, how she chose to stand there instead of stepping away, how she chose to stay. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because nothing needed to be added to that. The ship continued to hum softly around them, steady, functional, alive, and outside. The frozen world remained exactly as it had been, vast, indifferent, unchanged, but inside, something had changed, something that could not be measured in systems or probabilities, something that did not fit into models or outcomes, something human. Aris extended her hand again. Not because it was necessary, not because it was efficient, but because she chose to, and Noah looked at it for a second before taking it. His grip steady now, warm again, real, and in that simple contact, there was no calculation, no protocol, just presence, just connection, just a quiet understanding. That did not need explanation. The stars beyond the storm began to show faintly through the clearing sky, distant points of light breaking through the cold horizon. And for the first time, they did not feel unreachable. They felt closer, not because the distance had changed, but because something else had, something